I would say that like typical the way that I've come up in 12-step recovery, it would mean, to be in recovery would mean that, I've gained a relationship to a higher power, right? I no longer suffer from, an obsession to kind of use drugs or use alcohol or even engage in sort of like promiscuous behaviors, whether it be like gambling or dating, all in the name of giving myself relief. I've kind of learned the difference between my desire and my will, and I've established this grounding where I'm no longer quote unquote restless, irritable, and discontent. That's what the big book would say, the book of AA. Um,
I see.
and
Restless,
no, and
irritable, and discontent. Welcome to the
yeah,
modern
and
condition. Corey Gamberg, welcome to the podcast.
thanks a lot, man. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to speaking with you. As somebody who became like a Hillman convert, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago or something like that. And, I've been doing a lot of work to promote his ideas and trying to get people in like the psychedelic therapy world to take on some of his ideas and things like that. And I think like this podcast is one of the few that really focuses on his ideas and people who work with his ideas. I'm always excited to see like younger people take up his ideas and start to apply them to their field of interest. And so when I saw that you were doing this in the field of recovery work, addiction recovery, I thought it was really great. And I think it's interesting. So I'm like, yeah, I'm excited to talk about how you see some of his ideas, you know, benefiting the field of addiction recovery and some of the ideas that are alive there. Maybe just start like with a little bit of background. Like, how did you get into addictions counseling and recovery work?
Yeah, sure. Um, so just basically getting into addiction and, counseling work just came through my own experience as a drug addict. I grew up in this pretty normalized family, middle class family, older siblings, my parents married happily. And to me, like there was always this feeling of lack. There was always this feeling of loss or longing for something more. And that ended up getting relief when I started to use substances. And then, at a young age, maybe 12, 13 years old, I was smoking pot. That became like a regular thing. And right away, it was kind of a problem for me. Like I realized right away, I really like this. Like this is really good. It takes all this stuff away, and I could just kind of hang out and be. And did that just kind of progress? I got into opiates and prescription drugs at a really young age. I was probably 14 the first time I started using opiates, and then, had a prescription drug problem, Percocets and Oxycontin, and then, into harder opiates right around 18, 19 years old. And my entire youth and adolescence is really wrapped up in this experience of addiction, recovery, trying to get sober, being in programs, being in therapy, um, and no one really ever knowing what was actually wrong with me or going on with me. Bounced in and out of a lot of treatment programs and finally got sober about almost 15 years ago now when I was 20 years old. And really grateful for that experience, just in the sense of like, like my brain hadn't even fully developed yet in the sense of addiction or what was going on. So, getting sober at 20, um, I found a community and I found some like-minded people, and I met a few specific people that did something for me that, changed my life so dramatically, kind of just holding space for me and kind of giving me some context for the suffering that I had been going through because they had gone through it too. And being that sort of person for someone else has always been attractive to me, being able to kind of hold space with somebody and lead them through something or, you know, help them through something. And I started kind of working in the field probably when I was 22 or 23 and just kind of various roles, whether it was like a support tech or a behavioral tech, a counselor, and then kind of all the way up through some different like leadership aspects.
Hmm. So when you were, going through therapy and stuff when you're a young guy, was part of the problem identifying like, because they're always looking for like a cause, like what's the cause of the suffering that's leading this person to turn to substances for relief? Like that's the kind of common understanding of addiction. And you come from like a stable household, like you said, whatever, middle class probably, but like a good family. And so then you're kind of lacking a kind of a good cause. Like, why would he be using like this? Was that what
Mm.
you were finding? Because that's kind of like prevalent now, that idea that, it's like Gabor Mate's model that, everyone's got trauma and addiction is a way to relieve that, the pain from that trauma, basically. Is
Right.
that the kind of thing you're running into when you're going through that?
I think so. And I think part of it kind of twofold. Like I can definitely not look back at my life and pinpoint any reason that I would have become a drug addict. Like as far as a traumatic experience or anything like that or trauma in my life, the biggest trauma I can really point to if I was looking for a cause back then would be, kind of like the loss of certain friendships or like a friend group kind of, turning their back on me. But beyond something like that, that's exactly right. Like there was nothing that I could point to and say, well, this makes sense now that this happened, I'm going to do drugs. I'm the only person in my family that ever had a drug problem. The only person who's ever been, in legal trouble or been like suspended from school. So like the black sheep of the family rings true for me. And I sat in therapy and I went to, man, I was in outpatient therapy groups as a 14-year-old with people who were, in their 30s and 40s. So it was such a weird time, but it also did something damaging to me, which it kind of instilled this narrative that I'm always going to be like this. So like if you're having this problem now, you're gonna be like this forever. So at 14, I just kind of like
Hmm.
ran with that. If I'm gonna be like this forever, then like, you know, Scarface is like a movie that I'm gonna watch over and over again because I want to be like that guy. I'm gonna be the craziest cocaine addict, or I'm gonna watch, this movie or read this memoir because I need to learn how to be this person. So on some level, it really brought me into an identity but a negative one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like you get labeled as an addict, and that's kind of a designation that you carry for life. And there's a lot of fear around that. Like you have to identify as an addict because as soon as you stop, well, that opens the door to the addiction returning, right? But
Mhm.
yeah, it's funny because you're like, well, okay, if I'm going to be an addict for the rest of my life, I'm going to be like I'm going to be a cool addict, or I'm going to be like the best addict I can be, like going to be like William S. Burroughs, who was a heroin quote unquote addict for his whole life. And wow, look what he did. And that's interesting. I think one of the things that's left out of the conversation around addiction is, it's in this like kind of cause and effect model. Right. There's some trauma that creates suffering, and we're trying to look for a way out of the suffering. Therefore, the addiction happens. But what I don't hear talked about enough is like what I think, what I heard and what you're relating is like I was looking for something more. Yeah, my family life was fine. It was stable. My parents were happily married and all of that. But I felt like I was looking for something more. And that's what I can relate to. And I think that's what brought me to using drugs at a young age and doing all this wild experimentation through my teens and in through my 20s is I was looking for something more. And I was, I can look back now and understand that I was looking for a kind of religious experience. I was looking to connect with the numinous. I wanted to experience, the more than mundane, the super mundane. Like what else was there for me in life, and getting a taste of that through early psychedelic use and other drugs. It was a glimpse that there was something more actually. And the only avenue I had for that was using substances to kind of get out of my head and get into these other states. And I see that as a kind of like a positive desire, actually, that just found, a particular channel that was time limited in its effectiveness, to say the least, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think I agree with that. And I think that for me, it was it was definitely related to something of a creative impulse for me. Like, I wouldn't have known anything about the numinous or like the transcendent or religion at that time just because I didn't grow up in any fa like my family wasn't like that at all. I come from a Reformed Jewish family. So, we're the type of Jewish family that goes to synagogue like twice a year on the high holidays and like, we don't have Shabbat every weekend and I haven't been to synagogue in 20 years, but I was bar mitzvahed and I was like put through these initiation rites of like my quote unquote people, but they just didn't speak to me. And so for me, I think there was something about an urge to be creative and an urge to sort of make something of the life that I was given that I couldn't figure out a way to do. And I really believe there's some Jungian writers that have said something, that addiction is kind of misplaced creativity. And I kind of really believe that just because my experience as a child, I was really into art. I loved drawing. I loved sketching. I painted. And then at a certain time, I kind of just betrayed that aspect of myself, from, Hillman's standpoint, kind of, betrayed the daemon on some level. And I really believe that my addiction was kind of a response to that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's something in using substances, whether in its addiction or not, but in using substances to change your state. There's something of, I think, the yearning for initiation into the mystery. Like a lot of our initiations now are very secular. They're kind of initiations into some kind of societal norm or something like that, right?
Sure.
But it's not an
Sure.
initiation into the mystery, which I think, maybe it's just like a kind of characterological trait that, some of us are really seeking this. But I think, like, to some degree, probably everyone is seeking for a connection to the great mystery. And, it plays out in different ways if the yearning for initiation isn't met by something in the culture that recognizes that and has rites and rituals around that to direct the young person into this. So we end up like seeking it elsewhere and having, taking LSD or magic mushrooms to have these like experiences, but there's no container for it and there's no guidance. So
Right.
we get all messed
Right.
up.
Right. And I agree with you that I think, and that's one of the ideas of recovery that I really want to kind of work with is that recovery is not this idea now previously defined as, the abstinence of substances, but recovery is really a return to soul in your life. And if you think about it like that, then to your point, everyone that's out there longing for something can be in recovery. It just needs to be, shifted in the perspective of how we see it and how we understand it, that, we need a broader recovery for everyone in the collective of the depth dimension and the experience of soul, and not just people who struggle with addiction who get to do this thing called recovery.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, a few years ago, I started calling my work soul recovery, because I saw that
Hmm.
as fundamentally like what I was engaged in for myself and what I was best suited to help other people do as well. And like as we recover soul, as I recovered soul, I was sought those experiences, those altered states through substance use less and less. It was like, okay,
Right.
I've recovered enough soul that I'm good, you know.
Right.
It's like some of the substances I used initiated me into other ways of seeing that felt like a homecoming to me. It's like, oh yeah, right. The world is alive. There is magic and mystery in life. It's there all the time. My eyes had become clouded or something, through societal conditioning or just a lack of soul awareness in our North American society. And so like recovering that just it kind of filled the hole I think I was trying to fill.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had that experience too. And it was interesting that it kind of started through the work of Robert Sardello, which I'm sure you're kind of familiar with.
Yeah,
And
he's been
you
on the
know,
pod.
oh, nice, that's right.
We
And
we shared a mystical experience on the podcast. It was quite amazing.
yeah, I've never gotten the chance to meet him, and he has come up to this retreat center or um, kind of spiritual place that I go to that I've connected to through peers called the Alcyon Center it's up in Bar Harbor, Maine. And they really take his work and integrate some of his phenomenological practices. He has this practice called the heart work, and it's sort of this contemplative practice that brings you into a different relationship with silence, and his idea that silence is a presence, not merely the absence of noise. And you know that was the first time I really had that experience that you just spoke of, where I had been sober for X amount of years and I had done all this work and I had, sponsored people and been a part of AA and done really good things. And I kind of just fell disenchanted with that path. And I needed something to kind of awaken in me again or touch something in me that, probably was still really longing in the same way that it was when I was a kid. And going up there, it was this experience of kind of crossing a threshold. And, I remember the first time being there, kind of walking through this contemplative practice for, 20, 25 minutes. And then we went out as a group in silence. Nobody spoke, and we walked around a labyrinth. And then as we got into the middle of the labyrinth, we all just stood there. And for the first time, it was like I could actually feel that nature was alive and something else was surrounding us. We weren't walking around, them. They were walking around us. And the weekend progressed and we did another practice and we were kind of put out there to walk around the land and feel into a piece of nature. And I remember having this moment where I touched a tree for the first time and realized like this thing is alive. And
Right?
you
This
know,
thing is not a thing.
and it was just and like it changed my perspective in so many ways. And that was kind of the beginning of my that was probably like 2015 or 16, and that was probably the beginning of me kind of moving away from the really kind of traditional approach to recovery and spirituality that I had learned through AA mostly and the 12 steps, and more into a Jungian depth kind of Hillmanian process over the next 7, 8 years.
Hmm. Yeah. I think like when you know a lot of people are talking about the effectiveness of psychedelic treatment in recovery work. And
Mhm.
I mean, it's a no-brainer to me because like a good psychedelic experience will give you uh, that soul recovery moment where you're just in a different state of being with yourself and the world. What do you think about that? I mean, you say you're sober, and I know that means different things for different people. Like some people
Sure.
have had to do some kind of like mental gymnastics to get around, okay, well, these aren't drugs, these are medicines. And so
Mhm.
I'm not breaking my sobriety if I use something like ayahuasca or psilocybin. Where are you at with that?
Personally, I see them as medicines. I don't consider people using a psychedelic to be, quote unquote, a relapse. Depending on the frame of mind of the person. I really do think that, like I've read a bit of the MAP studies with like the use of MDMA. I've known people who have done ketamine therapy. I've known people who have used psychedelics, and to me, I have seen both where, some of them get out of hand with it, and then some of them are ready to receive it, and it is life altering. And I think to your point, like the idea of sober means something different to everyone, like I think of the notion of intoxication, and if you really understand or think about the idea of intoxication, then like no one is actually sober at all because we're always intoxicated by one thing or the other, whether it's our belief system, whether it's an idea, whether it's a perspective, but we can get drunk on all of those things. So I think the idea of sobriety gets taken too literally.
Hmm.
But at the same time, it kind of has to in the beginning for people to get some distance from the substance. But I think for people who are intoxicated by recovery, because I do think that that happens as well. I think those people end up having powerful experiences with psychedelics because it awakens them to that reality of, well, I'm just getting high on this thing now, or I'm just drunk on this thing now, or I'm just, smoking this thing now. And so I'm for it, I've seen a lot of people struggle in recovery who are purely abstinent and then they try something like that and it awakens something and their whole life changes. And it doesn't take away anything that they've done previously. It just kind of is the next stage or the next phase of what that's going to look like in their life.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you're touching on something that I've thought about quite a bit is how sometimes recovery itself becomes an identity that maybe at the beginning is supportive and empowering, but if they hold on to the identity, it becomes limiting.
Definitely.
Yeah, you agree with that, hey? So then what's it's led me to do in my work with people, and I don't specialize in addictions, but a lot of the people who come to me are struggling with addictions to various things, whether it's porn or weed or whatever. And one of the things I try to help them do is to see that there would be a life after some initial stage of abstinence or sobriety, but that is not a place to stay because ultimately that's going to be limiting to you in very in much the same ways that the addiction was limiting your life. So I've been just trying to like kind of work on that in my own way. And then so hearing about you talking about the idea of a post recovery, that there's like these different stages, or you're trying to introduce different stages of recovery. So I'd like you to talk about that.
Yeah, man, I think, and um, that's really where like the idea of depth recovery stems from, being I was someone who I would probably say recovery became an identity for me because I was so young also, but like also in the idea that um I was kind of given that message that like, if I'm gonna get sober, like this has to become your life. And so it became my identity and my life. And I don't think that was a bad thing, but I think that the phase that we call recovery proper, I kind of refer to as collective recovery because it's more about finding a collective and a community that can kind of give you a container for what you're going through, So for me, the initial stage of recovery is more about joining a community, finding connection, being a part of something, but also then gaining a mythology. I really believe that the 12 steps are basically a mythology of their own. They're a psychic container that holds and gives context to my suffering. It gives context to my pain. It provides rituals, it provides language, and it gives me a way to get through something for a period of time. And I think to your point, that's really great. And then if you overstay your time there, it can become limiting and it can also work against you. And so I believe that, getting sober the way that we understand it in our culture is really collective recovery. It's this idea of joining a group. And in some ways, I really do foresee that it's kind of kind of like joining a cult. Like you have to give
Hmm.
yourself over to this thing, and this thing is going to give you direction now for a period of time. You're going to follow its instructions and kind of try to see yourself through its lens. And that's really great. But then there's this moment where something starts to scream up from the depths. And I've known countless number of people over the course of 15 years who have expressed this in different ways. And, some people it happens around 3 years, some people it happens around 5 years. But this 3 to 5 year period, something really happens, whether it's that the brain kind of fully kind of heals itself and you can actually move on from certain behavior patterns and thinking patterns and then kind of start to think for yourself a little bit more. And two things happen. It's kind of like Campbell's, like you either respond to that call and then you move into whatever's going to come next, or you press that call back down because the group is telling you that that call, to your point earlier, is the addiction again opening the door. And to
Hmm.
me, that has become one of the most frustrating things to kind of deal with people or to get met with by people. This idea that moving away from something that helped you ground yourself and give you perspective and change your life is a bad thing. Instead of realizing that in that mythology, something grew to a point now that it's just too big to be contained in that narrative, in that story. And the idea of post recovery is kind of like opening the door and wandering out. It's kind of like leaving Plato's cave and realizing that there's this whole other world out here, and maybe even changing the narrative of how I understand addiction in my life, how I understand recovery in my life. And typically that has been met in my personal experience, but also with people that I've known, just with pushback or concern or dismissal. Um, and I think that's really sad because if not, then you remain there and you suffer, you know?
Hmm.
So that this idea of a post recovery is kind of it's kind of this initiation into the mystery now of what I've kind of been going through over the past X amount of years in collective recovery and trying to see the deeper meaning behind that. And, even for me, I want to say the more mythic meaning behind that, what stories I've been living and such.
Hmm. Yeah. I was out for my morning run this morning and thinking about addiction. And the image of a cast came to mind. Like in terms of something like standard AA abstinence recovery process, it's like a cast. Like you've got an injury, something's broken, and you need a structure to hold everything together for a period of time while things mend. But if you leave that cast on, the limb is going to atrophy. The muscles are going to wither away. The growth is going to be stunted. Things are going to turn fetid under the cast. Things are going to start to rot.
Mhm.
And I think, maybe it's not a bad image, because
No,
yeah,
pretty
at a
good.
certain point you want to take the cast off, and then you got to start to kind of exercise the limb again, and rebuild muscle. Yeah, I think like there's so much that you get from identifying as an addict or someone in recovery. Like all those things that you got when you were in your early 20s by finding this community. I mean, you get community, which is a thing I think we all long for in this culture. You get a worldview, which if we don't grow up in a religion, or we've kind of outgrown the religion or whatever, it gives us that. And then it also gives us a sense of purpose, right? You're on this like hero's journey of recovery. And then, then you can become like a mentor to, or sponsor to other people and help them. So you've got a sense of purpose. And these are like key things that so many people are trying to find in their life to bring their life more meaning. So it totally makes sense to me. Like I empathize with anyone who really dives in and identifies as someone in recovery, or they're an AA person. And but if if they stay in that for too long, I start to feel like a sense of sadness or pity that they haven't yet outgrown that, or yeah, it's like they're wearing the old cast, you know? Um,
Yeah, and I
yeah,
and I kind of think that on some level we don't know, and that's kind of like this idea behind depth recovery is like, where do those people go when it's time to leave that,
right.
and they still want to pursue the idea of purpose and helping other people, and the idea of community and connection, because I think AA is has been around forever, obviously, and it has a lot of great things, and like anything else, it has its shadow. And some of its shadow is that people that leave it experience being shunned from it, and lose certain connections, and people treat you like you've done something wrong, or you're one decision away from using again, and changing back to the person that you once were. But to your point, like, if I wear the cast enough and I follow the doctor's prescription enough, then my bones are going to heal, and
Hmm.
hopefully even heal them and they can be stronger again. So I have
Right.
a different set of tools, per se, to walk out into this next stage and of mystery around recovery and what that's going to look like. And I think it also allows you to take that narrative back for yourself. You mentioned earlier, like, the cause and effect piece. One of the things that I got from doing the 12 steps was this cause. And the cause was that I was kind of a selfish person. I was selfish and I was self-centered and I'm dishonest. And that's kind of the message. But again, like, I believe that and it works for me. And then it gives me a throughway for the next few years. But then I realized after 5, 6, 7 years, like, am I really selfish all the time still? Or am I just beating up myself over and over again to stay in this story?
Hmm.
And so I think the idea of post recovery is kind of reclaiming my story of addiction, my personal story versus the collective story.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. There is something like you get into AA or any other recovery group, and you become part of a collective identity. And again, that's a kind of a structure that gives you some support at a time when you really need it. But then, I think it's really important that people individuate. And so that means like leaving the group identity and finding out who you really are. And I like the way you're putting it, that then the addiction and the struggle to recover in whatever way that means, is then part of this larger story, and that it actually serves something in your life, like serves your calling, serves your destiny in a way. But it's not the whole story, because that's like, again, like fitting your life into a template of what it means to be an addict or somebody in recovery. And I can't imagine that at a certain point that doesn't start to, constrict people and rub up against them. And maybe that's just because those ideas that this is a stage of recovery and then there's a next stage, a post-recovery stage of individuation or whatever. Maybe it's just because that's not in the conversation. That's not even given as an option. And so it's important, I think, for, yeah, like, let's, after 100 years of AA, let's deal with the shadow of it, and let's like kind of broaden the story out. It's not the whole story. It can be a part of your journey, but it's not the whole thing. It's like that hero's journey. There's many stages along the way, and eventually there's a return. It's not just on a
Yeah.
continual cycle of you know helplessness or whatever.
Yeah. Or, and I think too that I do think that the addiction is in some way a result of the ego kind of betraying the daemon. I really do. And I think that, or the soul, or whatever we really want to refer to it as, that. And I talk about this with clients all the time, and giving them a different way to just reimagine what this phenomena of addiction is. And that, you look at your life and you think about that moment where, Like for me, it was all the art stuff. And then out of nowhere, I took a left turn because, I realized, well, art's not going to really give me the group of friends that I want, or it's not going to make me attractive to this girl that I think is good looking, or, it's not going to make me popular. So I'm going to go this way and start skateboarding or picking up a guitar, and I'm going to be all these other versions of myself. But the soul kind of knows, and it does everything it can to get you back on track. And I remember recently you had an episode, I think it might have been with Glenn Slater, and you were talking about psychopathology and like the etymology of that world, the word kind of like, it's the soul's way of loving us on some level, psyche pathos.
Hmm.
And the
Well, yeah,
symptom,
the idea is that, pathos means suffering. And so then uh, psychopathology is like the cry of the suffering soul in a way to try to like, I think, like trying to get your attention. Like
yeah,
we're, like you said, we're going in the wrong direction here. No, like turn
yeah,
back.
yeah. And I think that addiction is the most severe way, or maybe one of the most severe ways it tries to get you back.
Hmm.
And that's why I think if you can kind of transform through that experience, you reach this place of returning to soul. And and then it kind of puts you back on your life journey. Like I know so many people who get into recovery and it's like, oh, I've always loved this and I never did it before. And then they start and through this like consciousness now of a more of like an alignment, or what, the Jungians maybe call the ego self access a little bit, they start doing these things and they're miraculous. Like they're great writers, or they're great musicians, or they become great therapists, or even the fact that they have a child and they become a great parent. Like these things happen to them as a result of getting through the addiction. And in that sense, it's not something that's wrong with me. It's something that's happening for me.
Hmm.
And that's a hard thing for people to kind of allow themselves to ingest, because obviously addiction comes with a lot of heartache and a lot of darkness. But, if we can change our perspective a little bit on how we understand it and what it's actually in service of potentially, then the way we go about understanding recovery changes altogether.
Hmm. Yeah, there's not enough books on addiction that come from a kind of post-Jungian perspective. There's some Jungian perspectives, but they tend to fall into Jung's like kind of monotheism in a way.
Yeah.
Like I was looking at one, it's The War of the Gods, and it seems like
Hmm.
there's a lot of good stuff in that book. But what and I haven't read the whole thing yet, but what I was finding was that he was setting up this kind of binary, and that addiction was akin to archetypal evil. Uh, and I'm like, there's not enough differentiation there, because like for me, and I would never identify as an addict, but there was a period in my life where I was just drinking like way too much.
Mm.
And I think if I look back now with this, the lens of polytheistic psychology, it's like there was something about Dionysus in that use of alcohol, because I was using it to, I could say like from one perspective, I was using it to get over my social anxiety, and my social anxiety had a causal relationship to, the way I was brought up in my family and the relationship I had with my brother and my father and this kind of thing, right? And my insecurity, my wound, and all of this stuff. But another perspective would be that it was Dionysus trying to make a place for himself in my life, because when I drank, I became like so extroverted and outgoing and did all this wild and crazy stuff that was like a lot of fun but really dangerous, and
Yeah. Yeah.
and that gives me a totally different feeling about that time, that doesn't feel like I'm a victim of anything, but that I was
Right.
being like called by a particular God. And once I start to listen to that God, or be in relationship to that God and like his needs or his desires, and attend to that in my life, no reason to get totally wasted in order to find a little Dionysus in my life, or allow Dionysus to express in my life.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with that. And I think that I've had conversations with people who are newly in recovery a year or two, and we talk about something around the idea of like grief and really grieving the addictive experience because like to your point, there are moments that I'll never get back that were amazing that only stem from the use of substance and the nights that I've had with my friends or the conversations that have happened or the memories and they're not all bad. And
No.
and part, then part of moving past addiction, I think, in fullness is to really accept and grieve that, that there are things that I got from this experience as well that I won't have again, or I'll have again, but in a different way and through a different lens. But
Yeah, but maybe never with that level of, yeah, maybe never with that level of intensity again,
exactly,
which is
exactly.
like, yeah, I can look back and go, man, I'm glad like I survived that, but like, wow, I went on
Yeah.
some adventures, there's some wild times.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain people that I would have never met without that are, still in my life today. And whether they're on the right path or not on the right path, they're on their path. And like
Right.
that's all that matters. And like they're still some of the best people that I've known. Um, and so I just think that to your point, with like the black and whiteness, that's the only way we really understand the addictive experience. And that's sort of been a lot of what the influence of Hillman has done for me was, just kind of see through some of that stuff a little bit and see the deeper mythic patterns. Like I really attach to the Prometheus myth in the idea of kind of the mythic etiology of addiction. Like, it's based in this betrayal, and as he betrays Zeus and he's punished and he's chained to the rock, and that chaining to the rock is very symbolic of alcoholism. You sit there every day and the eagle comes and it pecks at you and pecks at you
Well, it
and then
eats your liver, it eats your liver, right? Which is
yeah, of all
perfect.
things. And then finally at nighttime it flies away and you get some relief. So it's kind of the experience of like all day trying to figure out how to pick up and where you're gonna get your money and all this stuff and suffering and suffering. And then you get some, minimal relief. And then you wake up again, the eagle comes back, the
Yeah.
liver regenerates, and off
Cycle
again you go.
continues. Yeah.
And, I find it so interesting that in some of the myths, what happens to Prometheus is, the eagle gets shot by Hercules. And, that happens in the 11th labor. And in relation to that, I feel like the 11th step of Alcoholics Anonymous is actually where a lot of people start to branch out and almost free themselves from the structure and conformity of the process.
Can you say a bit more about the 11th step? Because I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the 11th step is this idea of, continue to seek through prayer meditation, to expand our conscious contact with God. And so it's a lot of times where people pick up something like a mindfulness practice or they pick up, contemplative practice. Um, and I think one of the things that the step is really asking you to do is it's kind of saying use this step specifically as a segue to the next thing. Bill Wilson himself is quoted as saying that, AA is a spiritual kindergarten, you know,
Hmm.
and the idea is inevitably like its spirituality will only take you so far. So you need to expand your mind a little bit about that. And I think two things happen here. I think like there are people like myself who really kind of grasp the idea that it's not about doing mindfulness as my 11th step, but it's about, kind of growing beyond the steps and learning about mindfulness and then, kind of getting connected to that path. Um,
Well, and hopefully, I mean, mindfulness is kind of like spiritual kindergarten too. It's just like
sure.
start paying attention. And then,
Yeah.
hopefully that leads you to some kind of a deeper spiritual
Well,
practice or experience.
I think too for sure that like the West has commodified the shit out of mindfulness and it's just become
Yeah.
this like packaged up thing. But for
Something
me,
else,
like
something else for your toolkit.
exactly,
Your
like
mental health or your recovery toolkit, right? Yeah.
come to the spa and have a mindful day. And that's not what mindfulness is in Buddhist philosophy, or practice. But for me, it was like I really got into contemplative prayer and the work of the mystics and centering prayer, Thomas Keating and some of these thinkers and that really brought me into a deeper relationship with silence. And then from there, into Sardello and from Sardello into Jung and from Jung into Hillman. So, I think that in its best, that's what the 11th step does. It's kind of like this escalator up to the next thing. Um, but yeah, I just find it so symbolic that with Hercules in the myths, in the 11th labor, he has to kill the eagle with an arrow, and then Prometheus is freed. And
Hmm.
so it's really interesting, like if I find something like centering prayer or silence or Jung and I really dive into that fully and allow that to become this path that I'm walking, it kind of sets the addicted part of me free almost. The part that's been kind of chained to the rock or chained to the conformity or chained to the structure. Yeah.
And that rock can also be AA and the
Oh, definitely.
identification as an addict. Yeah. Yeah, there's
Definitely.
something about that's coming to me about like rhythm and repetition. Like maybe one of the worst things about addiction is the repetitive nature of it all. Like there's something like very kind of Senex about that repetition every day. I know exactly what I'm going to be doing, and I know how I'm going to be feeling, and what it's and you get stuck in that, like in the myth of Prometheus. It's the same thing every day. It just repeats and repeats and repeats. And so if we look at it that way, then maybe there's also something about the typical recovery approach that also is bound to that, you know,
I
that,
yeah, I definitely think so. I think, to that recent piece that I had put up in the Hillman Facebook page, about Chronos, like this idea that, the recovery is forever in this way, this very Senex
right.
driven way. And, I can even say that for myself, like getting into recovery at 20 years old, I was highly immature. But then I received praise based on moving into the archetype of the Senex, more than anything. Like, wow, you're only 24 years old. I would have thought you were 30 with the way you carry yourself and how you spoke. And it's like I got praise for cutting off the more, puer aspects of myself. And that's kind of what started to happen for me is like like any other traditional Jungian would say, like it becomes too one-sided and too much of the Senex. And then all of a sudden, when I started to kind of shift, I don't think people really knew like what to make of it because it was so different, and I became much more like loose with how I thought about something, or much less rigid about how I would help somebody, or you
Hmm.
know, more imaginative and you know, moved away from that Senex experience and really into a more puer experience. And then I think that the way I define the idea of depth recovery, it's kind of like the tension of the opposites. It's the puer and the senex, and we're kind of making this new thing now. Um, but we have to let people have that puer experience too.
Hmm.
If we don't, then they're stuck.
Yeah. Well, and what inevitably happens if you're too one-sided for too long is the enantiodromia, the kind of nature's
Mhm.
impulse to balance things out. And I think that's what leads a lot of people to like a relapse, is because that
Right.
puer need for adventure, for spontaneity, for excitement uh, comes back in full force, and then it's like it's
Totally.
always this pendulum swing between that senex and puer. Like, okay, I've got to, like, everything about abstinence is very much in the senex, right?
Oh
It's all
yeah.
about like limitations and structure, and I need these things to kind of hold it all together. And then,
Mhm.
like Hillman comes along and says, no, no, even like the kind of fantasy that we can hold it all together, or that it's our job to get it all together. All this
Mhm.
comes from a particular kind of perspective. And so, he's so postmodern in that way. And he's like, just so kind of amoral and saying, well, that's
Mhm.
only one perspective. And who's to say that that's the right one or the best one? Well, because we come from a monotheistic culture, that's kind of what we take as a given. That, well, of course,
Yeah.
that's what we want. We want to integrate everything into one essential being and all of it. And he comes along and kind of like throws the gates open to all the gods. And
Mhm.
that can be, I think, frightening to people who are really caught up in that monotheistic worldview, even if it's unconscious, or particularly if it's unconscious for them, maybe.
Yeah, and I think one way that I face that often is the idea of, people trying to define recovery in a monotheistic way, like or a very black and white way. Like this is what this experience is, and this is what this means, and this is what it looks like.
Well,
Instead of looking.
outline that. Just kind of give the doctrine as you've heard it.
Well, I mean, I would say that like the way that I've come up in 12-step recovery, it would mean, to be in recovery would mean that, I've gained a relationship to a higher power, right? I no longer suffer from, an obsession to kind of use drugs or use alcohol or even engage in sort of like promiscuous behaviors, whether it be like gambling or dating, all in the name of giving myself relief. I've kind of learned the difference between my desire and my will. Um, and I've established this grounding where I'm no longer quote unquote restless, irritable, and discontent. That's what the big book would say, the book of AA. Um,
I see.
and
Restless,
now,
irritable, and discontent. Welcome to the
yeah, and
modern condition.
very much so. And so again, think about this. Like, we have a 25-year-old person who we come in and we say, you can't be restless, irritable, discontent anymore. And if you start to feel restless, irritable, and discontent, then it might mean that something's wrong and you need to really work on
Right.
yourself. So
It's
it's
a warning
it's like,
sign. Yeah.
and it's so based on this idea of transcending everything instead of like, oh, you're experiencing that. Let's go into it. Let's kind of
Yeah.
wonder where that's coming from?
Yeah.
And
Who's restless in you? Like, is it not like the
exactly.
job of a teenager or even up to a 25-year-old to be restless, irritable, and discontent? Isn't that their job?
And in so many ways, I feel like unconsciously, no one would ever say this, but unconsciously, it's kind of like being in recovery is like striving for perfection on some level. Like, you don't ever harm someone, you never make a mistake, and if you make a mistake, you own it right away. And you're not going to be restless, irritable, discontent. And if you are, you do something about it right away and you move on and you get above it. So it's all really based in transcending everything instead of, kind of becoming one with what's happening, becoming one with the symptom, going into wonder about it, wondering about the complex that made you respond this way, per se. And I think one of the scary things for people is to move away from that into a more poly viewpoint where it would be like, recovery is different for each person. And part of that process is you defining it for yourself and how you understand it. And I think what really gets people going about that is the idea, well, then you can say that I'm in recovery even though I'm using substances. But those same people will try to make the distinction that sobriety and recovery are different. But really, if you're saying that sobriety is the only precondition for recovery, then it's really just the same thing.
Well, and
And
then what
and,
does
and
sobriety even mean?
right?
AA meetings are
Again,
famous for their strong coffee and proliferation of cigarettes. I mean, come on.
yeah. But also again, intoxication, like people are intoxicated with being in recovery and with being in AA.
Right.
And and they don't even see that. And that's kind of like that a little Hillmanian twist there, like no one's really sober, no matter what. You're
Hmm.
always intoxicated by
Sobriety
something.
is a fantasy.
100% recovery. I've about 3 years ago, I dropped that in a group and I said, I'm going to say something that's going to make you guys all crazy, but recovery is a fantasy and it's just fantasy that you subscribe to and you see the world through and you see you see your happenings through. but it's just kind of this thing, it's
Yeah,
kind of an idea.
totally, man, totally. And like you point out in that post about Cronus, it's never ending by definition. I'm in
Right.
recovery. There is no designation that I'm recovered. There is an end to
Hmm.
that period of my life, to that
Hmm.
struggle. Now I'm on to maybe another struggle and another aspect of recovering something in my life, whatever. But just this idea that recovery is endless, and there is no kind of final state of like I'm recovered or like I'm recovered enough. I can like stop making
Yeah.
that the
Yeah.
central focus of my life.
Yeah. It's just,
Man.
it just, it just goes into its next thing. And I really think this is important based on the idea that like, or the reality that addiction itself is changing and transforming in front of our eyes. Like I come from that oxycontin era of addiction.
Mm.
That type of addiction doesn't exist anymore. It's intensified, it's changed, it's become fentanyl, and that's very different than heroin. And so the drugs themselves are getting increasingly worse. And the ideas of recovery are staying put. No one is bringing new ideas to meet the new image or new um what's the word I'm looking for? The new drug addict. Like when I
Hmm.
when I in treatment 10 years ago, the presentation of a drug addict was very different than it is today. The way they even go about getting the drugs is insanely different. I mean, I've met people who have never really had a drug dealer. They just order substances off the dark web and it gets delivered to their front door.
Oh, they're missing out on one of the best parts.
Well, it's almost like if it's really initiatory, that's one of them. You got to wait in
Yeah.
the parking lot for 3 hours while this guy tells you he's going to be there in 5 minutes, you know?
Well, first you got to like
Or,
make contact and you got to know the code words and
yeah, yeah.
all that ritual aspect. Yeah. Huh.
And so as addiction itself
Right.
and changes as a phenomena,
Hmm.
recovery itself has to change as a phenomena. And that's my biggest push is like, I always bring it up. It's like we've had 90 years of AA, and like we have to really take a step back and like, could we use something new? Could there be a new approach? And I don't mean taking the 12 steps and making them Buddhist, and I don't mean taking the 12
All
steps and
right.
making them Christian. I
Which
mean
is the usual move.
right. I mean a completely new way of perceiving and looking and thinking about this idea of addiction and recovery.
Hmm.
Mm.
Or, yeah, putting the 12 steps. Okay, they're proven to work. Great. Let's just make that one part of a longer journey, right?
Right.
Or one part of a bigger story. Like
Yep.
12 chapters in a, I don't know, 100 chapter book or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Broaden the context.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's really like one of the only solutions I've seen. Like when you're saying it's like, well, this is a Buddhist approach to the 12 steps or a Kabbalistic approach to the 12 steps and
Sure.
things like
Sure.
just kind of throwing on another kind of spiritual overlay on what exists without changing the structure or opening up, its context. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, when I got into like Jung, and Jung is very prevalent in the big book in AA. I would say on some level, Jung is like an unconscious co-founder of AA.
Hmm.
And, you know, when I really got into Jungian psychology and got into analysis and really kind of started to explore individuation and things like that, it amplified the experience that I'd had in the 12 steps. It gave me new ways to understand that experience.
Hmm.
And then when I got into Hillman, it gave me an ability to see through the experience.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean?
Hmm.
Like to take a step back and be like, wow, all this stuff I like prided myself on, like there's a lot going on through there, and there's some shadow there and there's some different patterns there. And it just took everything and flipped it around and not in a negative way, but in a way where I went, whoa, and it
Yeah.
expanded my ability to kind of pursue recovery further and understand the addictive experience in my life.
I mean, that's so interesting. So Jung gave you a kind of a different, different framework for your experience in the 12 steps and maybe like deepen that.
Exactly.
And then Hillman comes along, kind of pulls the rug out and says, well, even that is limited, or it subscribes to a particular monotheistic ideology, or this kind of fantasy of the opposites and all these things that he criticized about Jung. And he said, well,
Hmm.
there's another world here too, this polytheistic world. Yeah. So I want to hear more about that experience because it's something I've talked about, a little bit with like Glenn Slater, how,
Yeah.
I'm seeing Hillman's work as a kind of a tantra that can help you really expand your mind. But in that process, there's an inevitable or a necessary deconstruction process that needs to happen. Like he really does, if you follow him, pull the rug out from under your deeply held beliefs about
Oh
things.
yeah. Oh yeah.
And so that can be disorienting, discombobulating, terrifying. There's no ground to stand on. What are you saying? Because he's so postmodernist in that way. He refuses to like kind of place a stake anywhere, and it's all
Mm.
kind of like open. And so I think that can
Mm.
be like scary for people. And so I can imagine in the recovery world that introducing some of those ideas
Mhm.
would be really scary for them. Like, wow, if you really open up, it's going to bring in like an element of chaos into these people's lives, and they need structure. Without the structure, they're going to be back in the addiction, and so that's going to be part of the challenge, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I kind of faced that. So, but and it's interesting that even when Hillman became more of a figure in my life, like I had picked up the Soul's Code 2017 or 18, but there's that thing about books where like you pick it up and it's just not the time, you know?
Yeah, I couldn't really understand Hillman until I was at least 40.
Yeah, oh yeah. And like I remember like sitting I remember sitting in my bathroom like reading the first couple of pages and then going, I'm not gonna be able to read this right now. And I probably put it down for honestly 3 or 4 years and just kind of focused on Jung and got really into Jung and deepened my understanding there. And then COVID happened. And so at this time where everything had the rug pulled out from it, I had randomly just come across the first volume of the biography and it was on Audible. And so I just downloaded it and I started listening to it and walking around my apartment complex daily because I just didn't know what else to do. And so I listened to this story over and over again of Hillman and his life. And when it started to talk about his experience of going to the Institute and getting to Zurich and, kind of pushing up against that old guard and all this stuff, it just started synchronistically clicking. I'm like, this is what I'm doing. This is happening to me now. This same thing is happening to me. And to your point, I think initially it scared me because it did lead me to make, d different decisions around, certain ideas around psychedelics, or it did lead me to start thinking and challenging this structure that for the previous 10 years, my whole life had really been based on. And but it also made me feel supported and like contained that this is an experience, an archetypal experience that continues to happen over and over again. The Senex and the Puer, the old and the new, the rebellion against the structure. These things happen. And so again, it provided me the beginnings of the new mythology, the new context for what I was going through that the step process or AA couldn't give me anymore. And I still think that everyone that I talk to about this stuff thinks I'm crazy. But then there's that one inkling where I say one thing and they go, "Oh, well, I do get that. That's interesting."
Mm-hmm.
And that little seed, to your point of like how, we take Hillman's work or we take Jung's work and we don't follow it religiously. We take it and we integrate it into whatever it is that we're passionate about. It's like that old thing of like, thank God I'm young, not a Jungian,
Mm-hmm.
and taking the ideas and making them our own and turning them into something new. And that's what Hillman did too. And that's why everyone was so afraid of him, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I just had a thought and where to go. Um,
mm.
oh, let me see. Where was it? Was it a good one? Oh, yeah. The role of myth, of story in being a container for experience. And that's a lot of what Hillman was doing, was like reintroducing some stories that weren't central to Jung or Freud. And so he was
Right.
following those guys. And like for Freud, it was the Oedipal myth. For Jung, it was the Christ myth. And Hillman was like, well, there's a lot of other stories, you know. There's this, there's some stories around this relationship of Senex Puer, which I think
Hmm.
were pretty central to Hillman. And it's interesting that you found that central in your work in recovery, because I found in my work, I'm 50 now, and so I'm getting a lot of guys who are like 33 to 40, this
Sure.
period of like where the new midlife crisis happens. I think it happens a little younger now than it did, I don't know, 40 years ago or something like that. So
Definitely.
guys who are coming to me and they're really struggling with what it means to be a man and their own kind of particular style of being a man, right?
Sure.
And I found that this is like the central archetypal relationship or engagement or tension that's happening is between the puer impulse and the senex. And so I found that like I think at middle age, my theory is that this is like the key archetypal struggle that men need to wrestle with,
Hmm.
because they're the puer in them is terrified of everything having to do with senex, of having to do with limitations, settling down, structure. Like to the puer, that's equivalent to death, right? And so
Yeah.
there's going to be like a real big rebellion against that. And then on the other side, some part of their life and their maturation process is calling for more Senex qualities to be embodied in their life. And so finding this relationship where having more structure and understanding the value of limitations in their life doesn't have to kill off the puer, but it actually can like make put up like guardrails for the puer to really let it rip, but in a more contained fashion, or it can give like the puer like a launch pad to go, soar to new heights. And so there's a lot of ways that those two archetypes really can work together if we find like better stories about them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so like I think it's because one of the things about addiction, right, is that like there's some part of it, I think, that anyway, that is like the person is locked in adolescence or kind of caught by the puer.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then then the recovery program comes along and it's all Xanax. And the puer is kind of dangerous. Like we don't want to let him in because it's gonna send us into a relapse or whatever, right? So yeah, like finding this balance of just enough structure or structure to a certain point, but not losing all of that youthful spirit of adventure and all of that. How do you see
And
that
that's
kind of playing out?
it's hard to say, and I think that that's kind of what I meant earlier in the idea of the tension of the opposites between like collective recovery and post recovery. It is Senex and Puer, and just kind of that idea of Jung's. If I hold the tension of the opposites long enough, then there's going to be the new third, and that's hopefully this idea of depth recovery. It has some aspect of structure, but it operates in a more spontaneous, imaginative, polytheistic manner,
Hmm.
where things aren't necessarily defined for you, but it's a process of moving into making definitions for yourself that kind of make it feel like it's authentic to you versus it's a box that you were put in.
Yeah.
And and I think as far as how that plays out, I think it's going to be an immense challenge just because the narrative of AA itself has been the guiding narrative on some level for, since its creation,
Hmm.
hospitals, treatment programs, counseling centers, and I will admit, like
It's a
it's
well,
definitely
it's a big industry, right? Just like the psychotherapy industry that Hillman was criticizing. And, so a lot of people didn't want to hear from him because he's asking us to revision this thing that is like, well, look, I'm doing pretty well. I billed $250 for 50 minutes and I bought my swimming pool and my house in the Catskills, like,
yeah,
hey, man, don't rock the boat, dude.
right. But I just think that
But you're not looking
there
to deconstruct as adding to something that does work, has its place, and all of that. But what I'm hearing is you're looking to broaden it to add to be an additive, not lay waste to the whole thing and like try something totally different.
I agree 100%. I think that the work that I have been trying to develop, post recovery, depth recovery, it's hard to introduce that in the beginning of someone's process,
Yeah.
you know. So I
Because
think
they
there
got
are
the
aspects.
cast on. They're like in triage.
Yeah,
They need like all hands
yeah,
on deck just to stop the behavior, right? That's going to kill them.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So like I think there are aspects of both, just like the subtle, like teaching about pathologizing, learning different relationships to the symptom and how the soul uses symptom and just like starting to drop little things like that make them think a little bit. But that structural aspect is needed. But it's just a matter of when that time comes, when that call from within speaks up and goes, well, I don't really know about this anymore, or maybe I don't have to do that as much anymore, that we have a place for those people to go and continue to build on the foundation that the structure helped them make.
Hmm.
You know, that's what that's what we're lacking in the broader addiction recovery space is what happens after you stabilize yourself? What happens after you've gotten your life back? What happens, when you decide like I'm no longer going to subscribe to the idea that, I can't make a decision for myself, you
Right.
know?
I don't want to continue. I don't want to be identified as an addict for the rest of my life. It's too
Yeah.
limiting. My soul
Yeah.
is like crying out for something more. Yeah.
Yeah. And
I
it's
think,
and
yeah,
it's
even like signaling to people that could be a stage, this post recovery, and so getting that out there in the zeitgeist. And I love this idea of like, okay, now you've gotten to a certain place. It's time to take the cast off. Now let's like explore some ideas. Like, like Jung's big question to us was like, what myth are you living? And so, like, what is the specific nature of your addiction? Was it a Dionysian addiction? Was it a Promethean addiction? What's like the kind of
it based in
particular?
was it based in hubris? I like the one of I use the myth of Tantalus a lot and the hubris of thinking he could trick the gods, like was it based on you trying to just, you know, trick the gods, in your life? Was it, that you can get past everything and you have no consequence and you can act however you want and then there was a consequence. Tantalus is stands under a tree with his feet in shallow water, and every time he reaches down to drink, he's like this far away from getting the water. And then above him, he's shaded by oranges, and every time he goes up to eat, he's like this far away from getting the orange. And like that's sort of the driving force of addiction as well. Like this, I'm so close to getting this thing, but then I can never really get it.
Mhm.
Like I think it's going to take away all my pain, and then it really doesn't. It just kind of continuously gets worse and worse and worse.
Right.
So
Like that's one
it's
particular style of addiction, right? But one of many.
that
Like there's also the
exactly,
Icarus style where I'm like, I'm not listening
exactly.
to my father, give me good advice about what path to take in life, this middle way. It's like, I'm going for the
Mhm,
sun, baby. I want to be like Kurt Cobain or,
mhm.
whoever.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's it. There are many styles of addiction, and in the same light, there has to be many styles of recovery.
Yeah. Well, it's like what Jung said that we have to create a therapeutic language unique to each person who comes in our room. And then Hillman took that further and said, look, maybe we need to create like a unique psychology for every person, you know? Which,
Yeah.
which a lot of like therapists don't want to hear because they like, I've got my toolbox full of tried, tested, and evidence-based tools, and that's
Mhm.
what I've got to work with. And like, wow, okay, then I can relax and not think about this stuff so much. But the creative therapist goes, wow, wow, yeah. Isn't that
Right.
exciting and interesting and kind of fun? Like, let's approach every relationship and like try to create a new psychology and new psychological language for that individual. And so taking that into the recovery world makes total sense to me, especially because so many addicts are, like you said, kind of like repressed creative folks, you know?
Sure. And
So the,
like longing for something like that. I mean, they are, like I can't tell you how many people come to treatment. They've been in treatment 10 times and, they go into a group and they go, what are we going to do? Read the big
oh
book.
my God, the script, right? Yeah.
It's like, oh, what are we going to do? Learn. And so people are
Yeah.
hungry for new ideas. I love that. There's this quote of Hillman's. I forget, I don't really know where it comes from. It's definitely one of the biographies, but he, letting go of old ideas for odd ideas. And I've
Mhm.
kind of taken that to be like this driving force behind the ideas of depth recovery. Like the ideas are strange. They challenge the norm. But if we sit with them and we introduce them, I've watched people over the last 5 years where we really introduce a lot of Jung and kind of try to introduce a lot of Hillman. Um, some people like their eyes perk up and it's like, whoa. And they come right up to you like, what are you talking about? Who's that? Like, where can I
Mhm.
read more about that? And, we utilize to the best of our abilities at Rockland Recovery, the Soul's Code in a lot of our groups because we're really trying to bring back this idea of calling, like this idea of the daemon and show people that you could, through a specific lens, understand your suffering in a completely different way,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
You can look back on your life and see the hardships, the wounds, the slings and arrows as being actually necessary to your development because your development is in service to your daimon or your destiny. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I recommend Source Code all the time because it gives us one of those, myths to live by that I think is
Sure.
really creative and generative and takes us out of the victim disempowered mentality. Yeah.
Yep.
Like the thing, I think this is so great. I mean, like I'm learning about it as we talk, right? And so the more we
Sure.
talk about it, the more I think it's just such a like really great idea to introduce this into recovery work. Okay, so the idea that we're going to keep recovery like spontaneous and creative and focus and tailored to the individual, right? And like what is their story of recovery or addiction? What that is also going to do is going to speak to the puer in them that was such a big part of their using, right? And which has been suppressed in the traditional recovery model. So to make recovery more puer infused, let's say,
Yeah. Yeah.
is going to like not leave that part out. And so it's working toward more wholeness in the recovery itself. Like, yeah, we've got some structure, but we got to like be creative in this too, and we got to speak to that unique soul in you that had its own style of addiction and using and all of that. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
good.
because to your point before, it's like, the recovery of the Icarus experience of addiction might look very different than the Promethean experience of addiction. And I think that's where we're at. Like everything in culture today is about like being individualized, my depression, my experience of depression, my recovery, my experience of recovery, like and so we need to move into that. We need to not stop that experience from happening because if we really take a step back, we realize, or if we're honest with ourselves, we would realize that by stopping that experience from happening, we're potentially causing more suffering. They
Hmm.
might not suffering in like the literal sense of they're using drugs again, but they're psychologically suffering because some part of them is kicking at the door, and it's just getting held back and held back and held back. And I think you said this earlier, that will inevitably lead to this rupture, and maybe that is the relapse. The
Yeah.
relapse isn't because you want to get high. The relapse is because, again, there's no authenticity. The daemon speaks again, and you won't listen,
Yeah,
you
it's,
know?
like Freud's return of the repressed in some new monstrous form, right?
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
And there is something about, the talk in the culture now about, my experience of depression, my experience of recovery and all of that. Seeing through that or listening through that, I hear the same story, even though that's the way it's framed, is my unique
Oh,
experience of recovery. For me, what I keep hearing is the same old story over and over again. And
yeah. And and that's a big thing. Like I wrote that reflection about Narcissus and Echo that I posted about sponsorship. And I write in there that, a, a big thing that happens in sponsorship isn't that the sponsor leads one to kind of imagine their own experience of recovery. But what they do is they really project a lot of their own experience of it onto the next person instead of realizing that it needs to be reimagined altogether if it's going to keep progressing or going anywhere. So, in a narcissistic way, we don't allow ourselves to change our stories because we become so identified with them in
mhm,
recovery specifically, and maybe even in other aspects of life. That's a way that narcissism shows up. We don't allow ourselves to reimagine our stories where we just see them for what they are, and that's how we want them to be. And I think
mm,
that's part of the challenge with depth recovery and the recovery community at large too, is that it would make someone have to think about their experience or their story differently. And I think people get real comfortable with that.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mean comfortable with, they get uncomfortable with that.
Well, when they get uncomfortable with that because they become so comfortable with their story, it can't
Yeah.
change. We reimagine. It can't look different,
Their story,
you
which
know?
tends to echo what's given in the culture, like the therapy culture or the dominant culture. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This is great. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and just having this kind of open-ended dialogue around this. It's definitely got my wheels spinning, and I think it's really great. So, if people are interested in like your work, where should they go?
Yeah, they could check out depthrecovery.org. It's kind of a website in becoming just as much as recovery is. And I just kind of post some writings on there and reflections, and it gives people an idea about, where I'm at and where the thought is. Um, and then hopefully some more to come on there. There's some information on the site that people can check out, and then hopefully there'll be some more to come.
Great. Yeah, maybe we can talk down the road as it develops too. It's been really
Yeah,
fun.
absolutely, man. Happy to be on the podcast. Psyched.
Cool. All right. Well, take care. See you down the road.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
Bye. Ciao.